Auzi, micuțule, mai întâi pentru toți securiștii proști,
Uriașule.
printre noi se află și foarte, foarte mulți
Proști?
securiști proști. Auzi, bă, securiștilor proști, mă adresez vouă.
Da, dar un limbaj civilizat.
Băiatul ăsta pe care o să-l vedeți acum, Douglas Macgregor, este decorat cu The Bronze Star. Este decorație pentru eroism în luptă, măi, securiștilor proști. A fost în războiul din Golf și a comandat trupele din turela tancului, nu ca anumiți generali în izmene care se dau mari strategi
Și care au bocancii expuși la muzee.
pe la anumite televiziuni din România. Da? Și numai că și-a comandat trupele din turela tancului, a făcut-o în confruntare cu unitățile de elită ale gărzii republicane a lui Saddam Hussein, reușind să păstreze în viață pe militarii aflați sub ordinea lui. Este unul din eroii în viață ai armatei americane, care, sigur, are o mică discuție cu binecunoscutul Marius.
Tucker Carlson.
Așa, și poate vreți să aflați câteva lucruri de la ei. Vorba lui Tucker, zice micuțul, poate ar fi bine să ne uităm la ce spune omul ăsta. A spus-o pe 24 ianuarie.
Noi ne uităm.
Nu e ala.
Cu ziua lui mama.
La mulți ani, Marius. Să fie sănătoasă și să-i spui din partea mea că a făcut un copil absolut extraordinar.
Mamă pe aceasta care ne urmărește.
Este un privilegiu.
Stă la fiecare...
Pentru mine este un privilegiu să colaborez cu acest copil al Doamnei.
Acest copil aproape reușit.
Deci, hai să vedem...
Uite, în fiecare seară, Varim, scrie după fiecare emisiune.
Știu, și să-i spui mamei să fie totuși îngăduitoare cu mine. Cu rog din suflet, da?
Este.
Mă bazez pe asta.
Mulțumesc. Hai să vedem.
Hai să vedem. Dați-mi unul ce, vă rog.
Unul ce?
Pretty much everything that NBC News and the New York Times have told you about the war in Ukraine is a lie. The Russian army is incompetent, they claim. Ukraine is a democracy. Vladimir Putin is Hitler and he's trying to take over the world. Thankfully, the Ukrainians are winning. None of that is true. Every claim is false, the last one especially. The Ukrainian army is not winning. In fact, it's losing badly. Ukraine is being destroyed. Its population is being slaughtered in lopsided battles with a technologically superior enemy, or scattered by the millions to the rest of the globe as refugees. Ukraine is running out of soldiers. As that happens, the question will inevitably arise, who's going to replace them? If the Ukrainians can't beat Putin, who will? The answer, of course, will be us. American troops will fight the Russian army in Eastern Europe. That's most likely. And the assumption is we'll win. But will we win? Probably not, says former Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a decorated combat veteran who advised the Secretary of Defense in the last administration. The U.S., says Macgregor, is on the brink of a catastrophic war that could very easily destroy us. Few Americans seem to understand that, but they should. Doug Macgregor is now the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, and we sat down with him recently. This conversation is worth hearing. Doug Macgregor, thanks for joining us. How would you assess and describe the state of the war in Ukraine right now?
That's an important question, and not enough people have good answers at this point. I think all of the lies that have been told for more than a year and a half about the Ukrainians are winning, the Ukrainian cause is just, the Russians are evil, the Russians are incompetent, all of that is collapsing. And it's collapsing because what's happening on the battlefield is horrific. Ukrainians now, we think, have lost 400,000 men killed in battle. We were talking about 350,000 a few months ago. Within the last month of this supposed counteroffensive, which was to sweep the battlefield, they lost at least 40,000 killed. We don't even know how many people have been wounded, but we know that probably upwards of 40 to 50,000 soldiers are amputees. We know the hospitals are full. And we know that Ukrainian units at the platoon and company level, that's with anywhere from 50 to 150 to 200 men, are in piecemeal fashion surrendering to the Russians. Not because they don't want to fight, it's because they can't fight anymore. They have so many wounded, they can't evacuate them. And commanders are saying, well, if I can't evacuate my wounded, I'm going to surrender because otherwise the wounded will die. And so they call the Russians, and they all speak Russian, and tell them on the radio, look, I've got 50, 60 wounded here. I'm going to surrender because I don't want them to be killed. And the Russians from the very beginning have always treated the Ukrainian soldiers very fairly and very gently. And so they know they're not going to be abused or mistreated. They know they can actually be exchanged for Russian prisoners in the future. So they've
Ce s-a
surrendered.
întâmplat cu avionul.
And I think we're going to see this army that we've been spending so heavily on increasingly melt away. And at the same time as we're talking, if you look at this long banana-shaped strip of territory in southern Ukraine that the Russians
Aia pe
control, if
care o
you go to the
eliberau ucrainienii, știi?
northeastern corner of that, south of this city called Kharkiv, there are major offensive operations taking place there right now. And the Ukrainian forces are being swept away in front of the Russians. And again, all of this happens in a way that is just not reported in the West.
Iată.
And in the meantime, rather than admit that this is a terrible tragedy that should be ended on humanitarian grounds, if no other, that the killing should stop, as President Trump said, stop the killing, we're going to continue. And this puts the Russians in the unhappy position of marching further west. Because from the very beginning, Putin and his advisors were never interested in a war with NATO or the United States. That's why you've had such incrementalism, this slow grind of movement forward, defensive operations for a long period to build up the force, and then continued offensive operations. They have over 300,000 combat troops in reserve in Russia. And I think they're sitting there and not being released to fight because President Putin anticipates the possibility that we will intervene in Western Ukraine. And if we intervene in Western Ukraine, the Russians will be ready for that. And the consequences for us and for NATO will be devastating because we are not ready to fight the Russians.
Dar voi, români, să-l credeți pe Bogdan Chiriac, care spune că Polonia
Dramatic.
e atât de înzestrată militar încât Rusia nu i-ar face față, doar Polonia singură distruge Rusia. Luați-o pe asta și dormiți liniștiți cum vă învață Ciolac.